The Princess Bride is one of my favorite all-time movies. I can still remember watching it in my 6th grade core class, and even then, it was familiar and beloved to me. My friends Matt and Bobby actually asked our campus pastor, Pastor Scott, to begin their wedding ceremony with the infamous marriage line, hot potato request that he tossed to me that I happily accepted. Thanks to the generosity of a family here at Bethlehem, Alyssa and I got to go see the Princess Bride screening that they did at the Rady Shell a few months ago. They played the movie with all of its dialogue and sound effects on these big screens that were above the stage, but the film's score was played live in real time by the San Diego Symphony. It was fantastic. They were in perfect sync, and you better believe that all of us in the audience shouted out our favorite lines as they came up in unison. Speaking of, did you know that The Princess Bride is not only entertaining, but it is also educational? I'm sure that you remember the very famous quote, "Hello, my name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." Well, that line is a masterclass when it comes to learning how to network with people and introduce yourself in a way that people will remember who you are. It contains all of the interpersonal elements that you're supposed to have. A polite greeting, hello, your name, my name is Inigo Montoya, a relevant personal link, you killed my father, and it manages the person's expectations for the interaction. Prepare to die. So, just remember that for your next job interview. Now, you might be wondering why I'm going on and on about The Princess Bride, and it's because this movie contains an incredibly important piece of information that will serve as a key hermeneutical insight for the gospel reading, which is just a fancy way of saying that it will help us interpret and understand this story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let us, as Inigo Montoya also says, go back to the beginning. As the story opens, we hear that Lazarus of Bethany has fallen ill. Now, Lazarus is the brother of Mary and Martha. You probably remember the story. Mary was the one who was praised for sitting at Jesus' feet, and Martha was the one who got yelled at for making dinner and doing all of the other work that needed to be done. So come find me later if you want to hear my opinions on that story. I have some strong ones, if you couldn't tell. Anyway, Jesus hears that his friend Lazarus is sick. But instead of rushing to him in order to heal him, Jesus instead decided to wait. He says, "This illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." So he stays where he is for 2 more days before finally heading on to Bethany. When they arrive, they are met by a distraught Martha, who comes right out and says what everyone is thinking, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Yet in the very same breath that she vents her anger and despair, she also proclaims and praises who she knows Jesus to be. She says, "Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." After that, they continue on and they find Mary, who says basically the same thing that Martha said. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus then asks to be taken where they have laid Lazarus. So they take him to the tomb. It's a cave with a stone lying against it. The foreshadowing in this story of what awaits Jesus is off the charts. Jesus approaches the very same kind of burial chamber that he himself will ultimately be laid in, and he orders that they roll away the stone. But nobody moves. I can just imagine them looking at each other with awkward and furtive glances until finally Martha musters up the courage to say, "Jesus, he's been dead for 4 days now, and to be honest, he's already starting to smell." If you look at the image that's on the front cover of today's bulletin, you will see that there is not one but two different people covering their noses with their sleeves. I can only imagine that that is because of how ripe Lazarus has started to smell. In fact, the guy in the front, the one in the orange, kind of looks like he's about to lose his lunch, doesn't he? Who said there's no humor in the Bible or biblical art? Now this is where the wisdom of the Princess Bride comes into play. In the Jewish faith, it was believed that the spirit of a person, after they had died, would linger near the body for 3 days before ultimately departing into the hereafter. But since Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, that means that his spirit has already moved on. It's the difference, as Miracle Max highlights, between being all dead and mostly dead. Because mostly dead is still slightly alive. And that's what Lazarus would have been if Jesus had arrived even just 1 day earlier. But because Jesus arrived on the 4th day, that meant Lazarus was all dead, which made the fact that Jesus was able to raise him that much more miraculous. Although I would love to see the person who would dismiss the miracle of raising someone from the dead just because it was done a day or two after the person had died. But as miraculous and wonderful and awe-inspiring as Jesus bringing someone back from the dead is, that's not the point of the story that I find to be the most important or prescriptive for our lives here and now. No, that moment for me happens back in verse 35. Jesus began to weep. You might be more familiar with the version that comes from the King James Version. Jesus wept, which was famously dubbed to be the shortest verse in the Bible. It's one of the few verses that is actually off limits to our confirmation students as they are picking their verses to memorize for their confirmation service. But still, it's amazing how much meaning and significance can be found in just those 4 short words. Jesus began to weep. First and foremost, the text says that he wept. It doesn't say that a stray tear or two trickled down his cheek. No, it says that he wept. Throughout the Gospels, we get quite a few glimpses into the divinity of Jesus, but this is one of the few instances where the fullness of his humanity is on display for all to see. Tears streaming down his face, the kind of crying that racks your body, this tremendous outpouring of love and sorrow at the loss of his dear friend Lazarus. It also displays the complicated nature of grief, because Jesus knows what he's about to do. Heck, he knew that he was going to raise Lazarus from the dead 4 days ago, and yet he still weeps. And in doing so, he gives us permission to do the same. He gives us permission to feel and have and express our own emotions. We live in a society that has an interesting relationship with emotions. There are many who believe that emotions are fine, just as long as they occur in small, controllable doses, and preferably in private, where the rest of us don't have to be subjected to them. When someone is being described as overly emotional, that is rarely a positive commentary on their behavior. As a society, we tend to value logic and reason over emotions and feelings, letting our brains be the one to lead us rather than our hearts. And this has led us to somewhat vilify and even look down on emotions as a whole. I was telling Alyssa what I was planning on talking about in this sermon, and she reminded me of the origins of the word hysterical. Now, there's a big difference between saying that's hysterical and you're being hysterical. The first is referring to something that is really, really funny. The second refers to someone who is being overly emotional to the point of losing control, and it has some very sexist origins. It comes from a Greek word that literally means suffering in the womb, I did some research, and I found out that apparently the Greeks believed that when a woman was being irrational, and I want to emphasize that that word is in quotes and that this comes from the dictionary.com article on the origins of this word. These are not my words. But it was believed that when a woman was being irrational, it was because her uterus was literally wandering around her body causing trouble. Again, not my words. But this belief that the uterus was a roving organ was actually held up until the Middle Ages. And over the centuries, various ailments and illnesses have been blamed on hysteria. Nervousness, fainting, anxiety, boldness, outspokenness, even the suffragist movement. The APA, the American Psychological Association, actually allowed a diagnosis of hysterical neurosis as late as 1980. That is absolutely wild. And while society has pathologized emotions when it comes to women, it's taken a slightly different approach when it comes to men. To be honest, men aren't supposed to have emotions, unless it's anger, of course. That one seems to be a pretty universally permissible one. But other than that, we are supposed to bottle up our emotions because men are supposed to be tough and strong and stoic, and having feelings and being overly emotional, that's stuff that women do. And God forbid that we appear to be womanly. Heaven forbid that we let on that we have a softer, gentler side, that we actually feel stuff. I mean, real men don't cry. There's no crying in baseball. Well, I'm sick of it. I am proud to say that I am a man and that I cry. I get choked up all the time, especially when we're watching TV. I cried last night when we were watching the Great British Bake Off. Those tearjerker stories that they show during shows like America's Got Talent and American Ninja Warrior, oh, I'm a sucker. They get me every time. I'll even get misty-eyed during an overly sentimental commercial. That's how bad it is. As Nick Offerman, who played the very manly Ron Swanson on the TV show Parks and Rec, once said, "We've been sold this weird John Wayne mentality that fist fights and violence are vital to being a man. But crying at something that moves you to joy or sadness is just as manly as chopping down a tree or punching out a bad guy." That is so true. But sadly, not everyone believes that. And that suppression of emotions has led to things like hypermasculinity, toxic masculinity, where the characteristics that are typically associated with being a man, aggression, anger, being emotionally stunted, these things are heightened and intensified. It's an incredibly damaging and dangerous mindset that teaches the young men in our society that violence and aggression are the only legitimate outlets for the emotions that they feel. And to all of the people who still think that real men don't cry, we have it right here in the text for today that Jesus cried. Does that mean that Jesus isn't a real man? Because that is essentially the same idea as the ancient heresy of Apollinarianism, which questioned whether or not Jesus was fully human and was officially condemned at the Second Ecumenical Council in Constantinople, which means that saying real men don't cry is actually a heretical statement. So check and mate. Even more, it's been scientifically proven that crying is good for us. Humans produce three distinct types of tears: reflex, continuous, and emotional. Now, reflex tears are the ones that come when you get, dust or smoke in your eyes, and they're meant to help flush out that debris. Continuous tears are the ones that keep our eyes lubricated and protected from infection. But emotional tears have been shown to differ from those other two types on a molecular level. Emotional tears contain stress hormones and all sorts of other toxins. And when you cry, that is the body's natural way of flushing all of that gunk out of your system. Plus, the physical act of crying releases endorphins into the body that help ease both physical and emotional pain, which is why a good cry can feel so good. Because your body has shed all of that nasty stuff that causes cancer and other stress-related maladies, and you've had a healthy dose of those feel-good brain chemicals. I don't know where this messed up relationship with emotions originated, but Jesus did his best some 2,000 years ago to give us a healthier model to follow. Because we have a God who took on human form in the person of Jesus, not so that Jesus could overcome that human form, or that so the divine side could redeem and fix the human side. No, it was so that God could fully embrace what it means to be human. Jesus wept at the grave of his beloved friend, his friend whom he would moments later raise from the dead, yet still Jesus wept. For a religious structure that has at times understood God to be this immortal, immutable, immovable, stoic, cosmic entity, this is revolutionary. It means that our human nature isn't something that needs to be overcome. We don't need to rise above things as base and earthly as feelings and emotions. No. The fact that Jesus wept affirms each and every one of us. It affirms who you are, what you feel, and it gives us permission to be human, to laugh and cry, play and grow and fall, and know that God knows what all of that feels like. So the next time that someone asks you, what would Jesus do? Just remember that having a good cry is a totally legitimate answer. Amen.